So I found myself in a pretty unique situation because I have a decent number of family members, but none of them are Bionicle fans. On first glance, you might think, well, why are you telling us this? That's actually something important because I can derive some pretty valuable information from these people because they're not Bionicle fans. They're not weighed down by the Bionicle lore or having seen or be familiar with Bionicle sets off the shelf, so they're not going to be biased towards any of the sets one way or another. Yeah, they might have favorite colors, they might have favorite shapes, whatever the case may be, but we're all people at the end of the day with our own biases, but not Bionicle biases in this case. And so today, I wanted to test a theory. Couple of videos ago where I talked about the Vaki being the first bad Bionicle sets, and I do mean that subjectively. I'm not saying that if you like them that you are wrong, because I don't believe that. I think they are still great toys too, and they absolutely have some things that they do pretty well. There's just a couple ways I think I would tweak them, and I made a video on that as well, but in this video I wanted to focus on weapons. Those couple of videos ago, I said that the Vaki were kind of like the first wave of sets to have ambiguous weapons. What did I mean by that? Well, weapons that, on first glance, can be kind of difficult to associate with a specific object in full. Parts of them are definitely easy to associate. You see the little clippers on the green weapon, for example, and you see, okay, wire cutters or scissors or something. I get it. So I wanted to play a game. And I asked my mom a question, a word association question. I decided I was going to take all 6 of the Toa Mata weapons and all 6 of the Vaki weapons, hold them up in front of her, and ask her just to name the first thing that she thought about. So here are the results. And without further ado, if you do like this type of content, make sure to like and subscribe. Really helps the channel out. We're getting so much closer to 3,000 and the views are going up, so it really does help out. The first item that I held up, my tried and true very first Bionicle weapon, this one right here. Now I want to mention that she did not see these being held by characters. She did not see them in any context at all. So, as far as she knows, they're not even weapons. I asked her to name what this is. She says, fire. I can see that. I gotcha. Now, I know that it's held in a character's hand, so I would say fire sword. But I already have that information. Then I held up this weapon, and she said sword. All right, 2 for 2. Doing good. Next, I hold up a weapon. Took her a moment. She says battle axe. Close enough there, right? Now here's where things get a little bit more weird. I held up this next. Not this color, of course. I didn't think that the color mattered, because it shouldn't matter, right? I held up one of these in lime. I did start to recognize pretty early on, though, and I should have stopped the experiment, that these lighter colors were a little bit harder for her to see. I was roughly 6 to 8 feet away, and she's a little bit nearsighted, but when she saw this, she said rake. And I can kind of see it. Now, if you need to know anything about my mom, she loves gardening, so seeing and hearing a garden tool associated with something like this, I understand. Then I held up this item here. Now, she doesn't know that this connects to a foot. She has no context to know what this piece is, so I figured this was going to be the hardest for her to understand. Kind of. When she saw this, she said a garden hoe. And on first glance, you might think that's a pretty weird association with it. But actually, with this sort of backward curve here, I can kind of understand it. If you're familiar with how to use one of those, you typically hit the ground sort of with it towards you in a lot of ways. And so seeing something that's shaped generally like this, it's not the same by any means. It's real far association. But at least I can understand what she was going for. The last one here, probably the furthest away from what the item actually is, but maybe a little bit more understandable. I held up this hook in yellow and asked her what it was, and she said an oil rig. Or not what it was, what she associated with it, the first word that came to her mind. And that I can understand. Obviously, this is a hook, clearly. But when you see this item, would you think oil rig? If you saw this on a platform far out, maybe a silhouette of it, no color at all, I get it. It's not the same as any oil rig I've ever seen, but I understand the general idea, given where the piston location is on that thing and how generally it works. So I went ahead and moved forward with the Vaki weapons, and to my surprise, she was able to identify some things about them. You're going to start seeing a pattern here in a moment, though. I asked her what this question was, and she said a lobster claw. What this tool was. Lobster claw. I can see that. Definitely a lobster claw. Okay, so I asked her next, what about this weapon right here? I can see this. She says harpoon. I can see that too. Now, I understand that this is actually carried by an Earth character, so my brain immediately thinks of like a jackhammer or something. But yeah, harpoon shaped. Maybe you see this and think it's a tether of some kind connected to it. Okay, I got that. I understand that. Next up, I hold this item right here. She says serrated knife, or steak knife rather, is what she actually said. And yeah, again, I would probably see a saw first. I'm more familiar with woodworking than she generally is. She's also a pretty good cook, so I get it. And it has that serrated edge. I'm there for you. Next, this item. Now, I immediately think sword when I see it, but she said bow, and I think that would have been my second choice. And honestly, if I didn't have the context of what it was, seeing the shape of it, a bow maybe even would have been the first thing I would have said as well. Now, the next two is where things get a little bit weird, because I held up both of these items right here. She had the same answer for both. Now, I held them up independently from each other, so she said turnstile, turnstile. That's a weird one. So I thought maybe she grabbed onto something different. Maybe she grabbed the wrong word and associated it with something else. So I asked her, okay, what is that? She told me, the gates and like subways and things like that. Okay, so she knows what a turnstile is. I don't see it with these items, but I think that's kind of the point. Now, if I had been shown this item without any context of it, I know I would grab onto those claw things immediately and think either scissors or wire cutters or something. Or maybe I would have grabbed onto this first and thought hook, right? If I'd seen this item, this one is a little bit harder for me. I can definitely identify that there are hooks there, but they're not really at like the best angle for a hook per se. So again, it'd be a little bit difficult for me to tell you what these are, but I could see hooks on this one as well. But the pattern that you start to detect here is that she's not identifying the full object. She's sort of identifying the top of each object. So she says lobster claw, and when I see this, I can absolutely see what she means. When I start to see it in the context of the full item, though, I see these calipers on the back end. I think, okay, so this is some kind of measuring tool, right? Or some kind of precision tool, some kind of grabbing tool, like a monkey wrench or something like that. And so I would think maybe a wrench or calipers. That would make a lot of sense to me. Again, with the context of knowing what this is, I think a jackhammer-like weapon at the front, and I see this hook on the back, but she didn't mention anything about the hook at all. Okay, the same is true for all of the other weapons. Really, the only Vaki weapon that doesn't have like a back end design is probably this one here. You definitely have a blob of plastic back here, but it's a little more ambiguous than any of the others. And it makes sense. It has to connect to the wings of the Nivok after all. So having those connections further back makes some sense, right? But I think that's where we start to get into the issue, that she identifies half of the weapon, but not the whole thing. Because these are kind of our first major kit-bashed weapons. Weapons that are definitely designed to be a bunch of things kind of all together at once. We can see this sort of scaffold pattern appearing on several of the different items here, right? So it's not something that's unusual. They do share a lot of designs, but at the same time, not enough to really tie all of them together in ways that I think look fluid. And also, because the weapons are much larger than the identifiable part implies, it starts to make them feel a little bit messy, a little bit cluttered, and a little unfocused. At least that's my opinion. Now, you could make the exact same argument about the Paraka, but I think that the Paraka handle it slightly better, if only because usually the parts that they sort of kit bash onto their weapons are identifiable as previous Bionicle weapon pieces. There are a lot of Paraka weapons that use aspects of the Staff of Light or aspects of like the galley hook and things like that. And you could definitely see aspects of the galley hook in something like this. That design is very similar. So I understand that it does do that to some degree here too, but there's also a lot of stuff here that's only here. Is that important? No, not necessarily on its own. But the other reason I bring up the Paraka too is that that's kind of written into the Paraka story, how they use these sort of kit bash scrappier items a lot of the time, right? We know that Avok is essentially the weapon maker in a lot of ways, but we get this sort of sense, this sort of feeling that like he doesn't actually know what he's doing. He just kind of straps things together to see how they work, if that makes sense. I like that. And so I think in the case of the Paraka, it tends to work better. And also, obviously, the Paraka have the ability to actually flip the weapons back and front. So, whereas the Vaki never really used this base portion in the first place, the Paraka do. So it feels a little more justified in their case that the weapon can flip in two directions. Some definitely do it better than the other, but I get it. So, how would we improve on these weapons? Let me go ahead and show you just something that I threw together very quickly over on Paint. This right here. That's not to say that these are better by any means. And I absolutely think that the connections could be kind of worked on here. I'm not typically a fan of just one pinhole on weapons. I usually like to have 2 or more if possible. But that wasn't the point of this little assembly. No, rather, this was taking the most identifiable parts of each weapon and also trying to make each of them feel unique from each other as well. So we get this sort of saw blade knife feathery wing-like thing at the top that I think would still look good on the Nevok. Granted, it would mean that probably redesigning the Nevok wings, but I would also honestly just redesign the Nevok anyway. I think there are a few points where it fails, in my opinion. That's just my opinion, and that's a separate video. The pinchers here you can see are basically what we got, just minus the bottom half, essentially. I'm covering them up from my view, but something along the lines of this. And I think that that looks actually pretty decent as a weapon. I get rid of this other piston here too, because I understand that it's supposed to signify that it's pulling on this backward, but it kind of sticks out. It looks a little clunky for me. It just kind of breaks the flow of the item itself, of the weapon itself. For the blade, I still absolutely enjoy the backside here too, but I just wanted something that had just more of a substantial curve, because I think in some ways it would be reminiscent of, say, like the air katana, for example, with that backside, or even like the Great Fire Sword from Tahunua, right? So in this case here, I got rid of it so we could accentuate that curve, and I think I really like it here. The weapon that obviously changes the most is the brown weapon, because it's a hook-like weapon, but the hooks are not really in the optimal position to be hooks. So I wanted to fix that. All I did was just basically get rid of the piston here, as you can tell, and rotate it around this pivot point pretty much. Close enough, right? Rotate the other side outward, and that way you get a weapon that is a bit wider than any of the others, but a bit shorter as well. You get the clipper half from the green weapon, you get the harpoon half from the black weapon too. I think it kind of sticks out a little bit, but that's not a bad thing by any means. In fact, I could see even using that on the front of a Toamata foot, flipping it the opposite direction. Could be kind of cool. No idea. Now, did I design these to fit with any other pieces? No, absolutely not. I just threw these together really quickly. But if you were to take reference from other pieces like the Toamata foot, for example, yeah, I think you could make some of these work with that as well. I think this generally works better as a concept. The weapons in and of themselves may not feel that much different from like Rakshi weapons, what separates these from those, but I think the main thing is that these weapons are just generally longer than the Rakshi weapons are, even when you cut them in half like this, right? And they all generally sort of culminate in a point, with maybe the exception of the hook-based weapon from the brown Vaki set. Still though, I think it works out pretty well overall. So I do like this. Let me know, of course, if you like this better, worse, or just as a separate option from what we got from the actual Vaki themselves. And of course, if you like this video, let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. I am continuing to collect information on another question, analysis, whatever you want to call it, from family members. And so as I wait for those to roll in, expect a video on that one coming soon. And of course, with that all being said, make sure to leave a like and subscribe if I didn't say that already. And also go ahead and check out Discord, Instagram, and Patreon, all links which are linked in the description. I don't know what I've said anymore. All right, take care, guys.